something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Today I'm talking with our own David Talbot, author of the masterpiece, The Devil's Chessboard. We'll be discussing the attack in Moscow, the UN Security Council ceasefire resolution, and RFK Jr.'s VP pick. Then I speak with James DiEugenio. He is a historian, prolific author, and the co-creator of Oliver Stone's JFK Revisited Through the Looking Glass. This episode of Devil's Chess Club is available to everyone courtesy of Four Died Trying, the new documentary film series which explores the extraordinary lives and cataclysmic assassinations of JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and RFK. A Patreon page for Four Died Trying has launched. It offers patrons the earliest access to new films and a number of other perks, now including access to the newest film, Chapter 1, The World as It Was, now available on the Four Died Trying Patreon page, and coming soon to other major streaming platforms. Please support us by subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. You will get access to many episodes of the American Exception podcast, including the Peter Dale Scott Oral History series with new episodes this month and more coming in April. Peter is the inventor of parapolitics and the deep politics approach, a peerless poet, scholar, and chronicler of the deep state. My own scholarship has sought to build on Peter's work as Peter himself built on the works of people like C. Wright Mills. This oral history series has been fascinating. Amazing stories and insights coming from a true iconoclast. I urge everyone to listen to these by subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. If all goes as planned, we will make a documentary film based on this series. David Talbot, great to be back with you.
Good to be with you, Aaron. Thank you.
So we are dealing with a lot of exciting and kind of scary events in the world since the last time we spoke. And one of them I want to talk to because we might have thought we were done with jihadi terror or something, but we're not. Russia says U.S. boxed itself into a corner by blaming ISIS for Moscow terror attack. This comes from the Cradle news desk. And in particular, in this story, they include some quotes from Maria Zakharova, the assistant foreign secretary. She's the person she's not the head diplomat, but she's the one who talks to the press the most, press secretary, basically. She said the very fact that within the first 24 hours after the attack, even before the fire was put out, the Americans started screaming that it wasn't Ukraine, I think is a piece of incriminating evidence. I can't classify it otherwise. It is evidence in and of itself. She said that on Sputnik. The second fact to note concerns the clamor by the U.S. that this assuredly was the work of ISIS. Of course, the speed with which they were able to come to such forthright conclusions is astonishing. It took them only a few hours to get a microphone, turn on the lights, summon the press, and draw a conclusion about who is to blame for this horribly bloody terrorist attack. She added that Washington's accusations boxed themselves into a corner because it allowed experts to remind everyone else what ISIS really is. You are behind all these ISIS-type structures. You, the United States, Great Britain, yourselves brought them into being. So what do you make of this? Do you have any thoughts on this terror attack and the Russian response to it and the U.S. response saying, oh, it's ISIS immediately? I mean, it's all quite suspicious, don't you think?
It is very suspicious, Aaron. But let me, introduce my comments by saying I'm not an expert on terror activity in Russia or with ISIS. That said, given my knowledge, like you, my reading of the press and the media on the subject, we don't know what the hell ISIS is at this point. Is it sponsored by the U.S.? Is it, does money and support go to ISIS? What the hell is ISIS? So when the U.S., the other superpower, blames the terrorist attack on a shadowy terrorist organization that we ourselves, as the U.S., may sponsor at this point, carries out our mission in some way, then who the hell knows? I mean, we don't know what happened, unfortunately. This is a terrible incident. It targeted civilians. I'm against terror that targets civilians, no matter who perpetrates it. And what's going on in Gaza, by the way, I categorize as terror. That's nationally sponsored terror. Israel's committing terror in Gaza. So look, terror has, I think, national sponsorship all around the globe. And I think what happened in Moscow, my suspicion is something very powerful was behind it. Was Ukraine behind it? They'd be really mad to have sponsored something like this, an attack on civilians. Is Ukraine, are they allowed? Should they be allowed to target military industrial figures in Russia? Yes, I would say that they are morally and politically justified to do that. But an attack on apparently a civilian target is unconscionable, I think. And we want to know who sponsored it.
Right, and they caught the people heading back to Ukraine, apparently, which is obviously pretty incriminating. And they were Tajik nationals, but if they were jihadis, it does seem strange because they were paid and they claim to have been offered money on TikTok, and they didn't. If you're a jihadi, then you want to be a martyr. That's your escape plan. You escape to heaven, and they didn't do that. They tried to escape to Ukraine.
We don't know who the actual perpetrators and the actual terrorists were. Eric Ambler, I start my book, The Devil's Chessboard, with a quote from Eric Ambler. It's not who actually carried out, who did the murder, who shot the rifle, it's who paid for the bullet. So did the perpetrators who were frog marched, wheelchaired into the courtroom in Moscow after being tortured and terrorized and beaten, did they actually carry out this terrible atrocity? We don't know. I mean, when Russian authorities leak the video of the torture that was perpetrated on these people, we don't know for sure they were guilty. They would say anything at that point. Most people would say anything after being tortured. So I don't know who was guilty. We don't know to this day who's guilty, who carried out these crimes. And we don't know who paid for it. That's even more important. Who sponsored this atrocity? So ISIS, what the hell is it at this point? I suspect it carries out at this point, as many observers do, the will of the U.S. But Russia also is an empire. Let's say it what it is. It's also aggravated and assaulted and invaded neighboring countries and regions, because that's what Putin and Russia does. That's what powerful countries do. So yes, it could have been blowback from one of their imperial offenses against the people who live near them. And who the hell knows at this point?
Right. I see Russia's foreign policy as being almost entirely reactive in the Putin era. I mean, they did have military conflicts in Georgia, but those were in response to U.S. Attempts to expand NATO. I don't know what they've done that really hasn't been not just done in response to that, but also undertaken after stating clearly that they will not allow NATO to expand into their, strategic, depth or whatever, to be able to threaten Russia. I've seen them. I think most of their, even the Syrian thing was in part. I mean, that was actually totally lawful because they were invited by the Syrian government to intervene. But I saw that as being an attempt to stop the U.S. from turning that into another jihadi enclave that could be used to launch more terror across, the Russian near abroad or into Russia itself. I mean, they did things like this in the 80s. They actually, on the Mujahideen era, they had they did have raids even into Russia proper, into the Soviet Union proper. It wasn't just Afghanistan. So they've been dealing with this for a long time. In Chechnya, we ginned up the jihadis there. So they've had a lot to deal with. I tend to think that the idea of it being Russian in any way, or I mean, I is Russia doesn't have a motive to do this, best I can tell, because they've already kind of got the population mobilized, and as much of the population thinks Putin isn't going far enough as otherwise. So I tend to think that they have the right people, and that it was a bad look to have them, you know, brutalized the way that they did, the alleged perpetrators, because which to me also says it's maybe less likely to be a spectacle that they engineered, because it kind of makes them look a little thuggish for sure to torture these guys the way they did. I mean, if they really cut off the guy's ear, that's pretty horrific. They try to make the case that he hurt himself running or cut it running away, but I don't find that plausible.
The ear was cut off and stuffed into his mouth. Brutal is putting it nicely.
Yeah, no, that's some horrific.
Look, you and I agree about Ukraine. You and I agree that the U.S. is the number one imperial power in the country. It throws its weight around all the time. It has for many, many decades overthrown governments, killed leaders. The U.S. is the number one perpetrator of violence and intrigue on the globe. That's a fact. But Russia and Putin, I'm no friend of Russia or Putin either. I think on a much, much smaller scale, Putin has also killed people, overthrown people, and also attempted to, I think, exert his influence in this part of the world. Now, it's much less than the U.S. empire, I agree, but Putin has his own imperial designs, and he definitely suppresses dissent. You and I would be killed in that country if we lived in Russia. If we weren't poisoned, we wouldn't be doing our job as independent.
I don't know enough about the Russian media sphere to say. They have an opposition to Putin, and as I understand, the most popular opposition is the communist one. And you can hear interviews with leftists. If you look for them, I've at least heard a couple of them. I haven't spent a lot of time looking for them, but people who are not in favor of like Putin's politics per se, but are I think that they may have some space to speak about these things. I think that where you run into difficulty in Russia is if you are on the U.S. side, which is statistically very small, but like pro U.S. liberals in Russia, I think, are a very small group, and I think that is where it may be that you would run afoul of the authorities. I don't know what it is like for random people who criticize the government. I don't take at face value U.S. pronouncements that you are not allowed to criticize the government in any way, shape, or form. But I do think that they do suppress the media in ways that are not in accordance with the U.S. First Amendment. Of course, the U.S. does too, but Russia doesn't have a First Amendment.
This way, if I ran salon, which I did for a number of years in this country, I founded salon, and it was independent voices, different journalists criticizing power and authority from a spectrum of dissent. I don't think we'd be looked on with favor by the Kremlin. I think we would be seen, particularly if we had influence, if we reached mass audience, we'd be seen as a major threat to his regime. And let's face it, Putin has been leader for life. I'm anarchistic enough to believe that a leader should not be a leader for life. And he's been in power way, way, way too long. So his regime, I think, would see independent journalists like Salon in my heyday, and your podcast, frankly, your videocast, as a threat if it reached a certain number of people. So yes, he tends to tolerate people who are even more authoritarian, more despotic than he is. But he does not look with favor on the liberal media, progressive media in that country, dissenters. So if they have a sizable audience. And now I think, like Randolph Bourne, the great critic in this country, said, war is the soul of the state.
The health of the state.
The health of the state is, I think the war in Ukraine, unfortunately, which I think I agree with you, provoked by the NATO in the West, who kept encroaching on Russian territory, and Putin had no choice but to go to war there. They boxed him in. But nonetheless, I think the war has had a very deleterious effect on dissent in Russia, as it always does in every country.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a mindset that they are facing a very powerful foe who is intent on trying to destroy them if they can, and as a result, you get this sort of total war mindset, and this civil liberties kind of go out the window. It seems. We'll see how things unfold there. I think that the war may be lost before the election, even, which is Biden's worst nightmare. Because, I mean, the obvious thing is, why don't they just end the war now? They could end the war now. They don't want to because they don't want to endanger Biden's election chances. That's the only reason I can see. And so here we are.
Switching to Gaza and Israel, I think Biden even realizes it's a major political problem for him. What did he say yesterday? That yes, there is blood on his hands from Israel. I think he realizes he's going to lose these battleground states unless he pivots very quickly on this war, and like you say, settles the war very, very soon. So I think it serves his interest when Chuck Schumer speaks out against Netanyahu, as he did recently in the Senate. And I think it serves Biden's interest as a split with Netanyahu. Netanyahu has become the face in this country of intransigence, of Israeli violence. And Israel has been so isolated in the world community more than ever now because of its actions in Gaza, which are reprehensible, which have been voted on by the UN as genocide. It is genocide. They're killing children now through famine and killing women. And people have no connection to Hamas or, the invasion of Israel. An invasion, I believe, that was, and I think we'll learn, was allowed to occur by Netanyahu's regime. I think Israeli intelligence is so smothering, so all-inclusive, that they knew in advance about October 6th, about the Hamas offensive. And they allowed it, Israel allowed it to happen, because it saved his ass. It saved Netanyahu, that war. And it was the only thing that could possibly save him. He had people on the streets demanding his resignation, a new election, as Schumer just did. And so it was the only thing that could keep him in office. And of course, he's aligned with the worst people in Israel, the most,
He's a moderate, though. I think there are people to his. He is essentially a moderate in Israel right now. That's the frightening thing. The other people that they're talking about bringing in are just as bad, if not worse, than him, ideologically. Although they're not in politically desperate situations personally like he is, but ideologically, the whole population is by and large in favor of the slaughter. That's why it continues the way that it does. My understanding from people inside there is that there's very little dissent or discussion about it at all, that it's all just going on like they're on autopilot, and everybody that's criticizing them is anti-Semitic.
Yes, I think right now the Israeli people are hunkered down and are acting very tribalistically, and they're not peace-oriented at all. And they need to be for their own survival. They have to be actually braver and more courageous than that. And they can't just be defensive at this point, because the survival of Israel is at stake at this point. So I agree that I've said many, many times in this video cast and other places, that the ultimate solution, the only solution, is a secular one state solution. The Palestinians and the Israelis have to learn to live together or kill each other in one country, I believe, because it's a small area over there. It's a small area that's been compromised consistently by Israeli settlers who are armed and aggressive. And you can't tell them, no, behave yourselves, because they don't. So the only way is the way that was learned in Northern Ireland, when Protestants and Catholics stopped killing each other and worked out an agreement. And that's the only way, I think, forward for the Palestinian people and the Israeli people.
Well, alternatively, and I agree that a one state solution is the best. However, even the Irish example, by creating a two-state solution in Ireland, in effect, the it stopped the immediate horrors, and I think in the long term it paves the way for eventually Ireland to be one Ireland. I think that is could well happen. So it may be, and I can't predict this, and I don't have any input into it. It may be that a if the situation gets really dire, then the world would have to accept the creation of a Palestinian state. Just the UN could do it, and this could potentially lead to eventually to a one state solution, because it would change the dynamics so much that it would, perhaps it would or not. I don't know what they do. They just somehow Palestinians need to have statehood and citizenship under a government that is there to do what a government is supposed to do for a people, and they need to stop the genocide. And then
By the
that's the
way,
most
Aaron,
urgent thing.
I think you agree with this, that yes, maybe a two-state solution is a necessary intermediary step, but if the Palestinian people and the Israeli people, as they do in some areas like Haifa and others, have learned to live together, if they do, and if they live in peace and harmony together, and they prosper together, they're very educated and I think hardworking and very creative people. And such a state, if there is one in the future, a secular state that includes both people, would be amazing. It would be an amazing example of democracy around the globe, and also a great, I think, enterprise, because those people are both enterprising, and they're both linked by history, by the way, like the Irish were, the Irish Protestants and Catholics. So I think such a secular state would take off and would be an example of beacon to the world.
And I think with it happening at roughly this historical moment, I mean, this time period, in the next decade, is at the same time that the U.S. unipolarity is ending. I mean, the rules based world order that we see is exposed now as a sheer farce. Israel, with the full backing of the U.S., has acted totally lawlessly, and really, with the Security Council vote here recently, the U.S. They abstained from voting on a call for an immediate ceasefire for at least the duration of Ramadan, and the U.S. did not veto this. So the UN Security Council has demanded an immediate ceasefire, and the U.S. response was to try to look good by not vetoing it, but then afterwards to say, "Oh, it's not binding." And there's no basis for this legally whatsoever that I know of. Article 25 of the UN Charter says members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council. So there is no, unless it's non-binding or any other sort of caveat that I know of. So they're still trying to sort of have it both ways, but they are starting to distance themselves from this. And if as it becomes clear that the U.S. isn't able to do these things around the world anymore, it would hopefully affect a change in attitude and orientation towards the rest of the world among U.S. leaders and our various satellites and proxies, or I don't even know what you call the relationship of Israel and the U.S. It's hard to know who's the patron, who's the client sometimes. It's been amazing to watch as people like Chuck Schumer try to dial down the U.S. side, or the Israeli side, I'm sorry, as you were talking about, because it says it complicates the argument for people who want to say, some people on the left want to say like, oh, Israel is doing these terrible things, but it's because they are a lapdog of the U.S., because they think U.S., it's like a sort of a general Marxist-Leninist thing. Everything is about capitalism and imperialism, which it often is. I think you normally are not going to go wrong with that when you think about U.S. foreign policy, but what you seeing the U.S. try to restrain them now in different ways and sort of looking sort of pitiful and vacillating. This to me says you have to conclude that Israel is able to do things against the interests of the U.S., and it should make you reconsider a lot of other assumptions about who's really been steering U.S. foreign policy, because it hasn't been in the U.S. interests, but a lot of it seems to have been in Israeli interests, or at least these fanatical Zionists, like the Iraq War, the war in Syria, the attacking Libya, making the Middle East safe for Israel no matter what. Like, these have damaged the U.S. prestige enormously and cost a lot of money, but they were very in line with Israel's goals. And now we have this. So I feel like this is just a watershed moment, and it should make the scales fall from people's eyes.
Well, I think you hit on a number of points, Aaron, that I think are valid. But the key question that you've raised and we've raised on the show is, will the U.S. finally have the national dialogue that's been imperative for years about empire and about peace and war? What direction do we want to take the country? As you know, President Kennedy, many years ago, over 60 years ago, tried to have this national dialogue at the time about war and peace, the Cold War. What is the role of the U.S.? What should be the role of the U.S. in the world community? And he began to speak about that years and years ago. No president has had that vision and courage since then. And I believe that was the reason he was killed, because he actually called into question America's role in the world. So Bobby Kennedy Jr., as you know, you and I have both been aligned with this campaign, very, very critical, for good reason, of how blind he is about Israel and Gaza. But apart from that, big gorilla in the room, he's raised the questions about the U.S. empire that desperately need to be discussed by the media, by every citizen in America, and should be discussed during the presidential race. Do you think Trump and Biden at their age will raise these questions about the U.S. empire? No, of course not. They want more. Trump wants more aggression from the U.S., more, saber rattling. And Biden, they say, it looks weak and ineffective when it comes to Israel, supposedly dependent on our arms and our foreign aid. And it's pathetic. So this is, we're now reaching the point of the U.S. empire as a pathetic kind of giant. And we desperately need to have this in the presidential race, this dialogue about where are we going, about the military industrial complex that runs our economy, about the forever wars. We've been at war. I'm 72. We've been at war somewhere in the globe my entire life. That's absurd. That's tragic. So yes, Bobby Kennedy is the only one. I just heard him speak again out here in Oakland when he introduced his new running mate, Nicole Shanahan, someone I was very, by the way, critical of and worried about until I actually heard her speak. And she gave a great speech, I have to say. I became, again, a great supporter of Bobby's after Nicole Shanahan, gave her a speech, because she hit on so many subjects near and dear to the American people, from the environment to health to the forever wars and so on. And so I welcome that debate, finally, if she gets on stage with Kamala Harris and whoever Trump picks, maybe Tulsi Gabbard looks like at this point. I can say why I feel that way. I think she'll finally raise these issues, and maybe Tulsi will too, as a former veteran, at least talk about the war machine and why it keeps wanting more and more blood and arms to keep running. So yes, let's talk about Nicole Shanahan, who's Bobby's VP pick, and let's talk presidential politics.
Right. I don't know what to make of her as a candidate, as a VP pick. The thing she's most famous for before this is having some sort of affair with Elon Musk, which I don't typically want to be concerned about politicians and their marital affairs. Like, I actually think that's weird. On some level, I guess I disapprove of Elon Musk enough that that is a little disturbing to me. But when you say who are these, when you look at these other people that they will be going against, that she would be, sharing the VP candidacy with in other parties, right? Like, I mean, Kamala Harris, Mike Pence, potentially Tulsi. I mean, these are, she doesn't seem worse than them at any rate. And at least has Bobby's general platform of wanting to move the U.S. away from a war footing. I also think that I mean, it's like RFK, as weird as RFK's campaign has been, and he has embraced kind of libertarian, pro-capitalist people who are almost utopian about how great capitalism is. Whereas I see capitalism as fueling all of the corporate corruption and the empire that he uh, also, denounces. It's like he's denouncing the symptoms of basically capitalism without while embracing it. On the other hand, what are you going to do in the U.S.? There's no opposite. There's no real opposition to capitalism, and there's nothing that you can do without capital, without money. So it's like a perfect way to keep the system going forever. And I think the only way you're going to fundamentally reverse that is if we entered a hellish stage of like Russia before the revolution and so on. So in a way, I think leftists and their purity ideas and their idea of like consciousness will just keep rising no matter what because of the great dialectic. I don't think that that's borne out by historical experience. I really regret the fact that Kennedy has taken such an odious position on something that is so categorically morally evil, like this genocide in Gaza. That is the big issue because I can overlook having to compromise with capitalists, but after a while, there's this Israel issue. All that said, I don't know that he doesn't have a shot at this just by virtue of how terrible his opponents are. And I'm even thinking if you're the establishment, what Kennedy is calling for, I think, is going to be better in the long run for even for them and their prospects compared to Trump or Biden. Biden and Bidenism and the neoliberal autopilot of empire. That is a disaster. Trump is going to be terrible for American prestige. Yes, he will be a right winger in charge, and people will make money in the short term and will have a state geared to their interests. But like in general, what Kennedy is proposing is the only like some measure of reform and a reorientation away from global dominance and making America a normal country that cares about taking care of its people and having institutions that function. Like he seems to be
Exactly.
the better choice, even for the oligarchs.
Yes. Let's talk about Nicole Shanahan because I was there in Oakland and I was there at the after party for Bobby after the rally. So yes, you're right, Aaron. She was presented by the corporate media as nothing more than basically a tech hoe. let's face it. She married Sergey Brin, one of the founders of Google. She had a daughter with him. Then apparently, according to the corporate media, Wall Street Journal and so on, she had an affair with Elon Musk, which broke up the marriage, and she walked away with a lot of money. End of story. And she looks hot and so on. And that's the way the media presented her. So I was very critical in advance for that reason. I thought he could do much better. I then heard more information, which I'll tell you about. But more important, I heard her speak, as I said earlier. And she was so genuine, so smart, so from the heart that it turned me around, actually, her speech. She's more than the media has presented her. Guess what? So is Bob Kennedy, more than the media has presented him. They keep spinning crazily, wildly about Bobby Kennedy, too. And they will do the same about Nicole Shanahan. Nicole Shanahan, I think, is much more than the media portrait of her. She's much deeper. She's thoughtful. She has an autistic daughter and she knows that America suffers terribly, as Bobby does, from chronic illness. Particularly young people are very concerned about this issue. The pollution in the air, in the food we eat, in the water, in the soil. She is at the forefront of all those issues. She's a lawyer. She's, like Bobby, has battled these companies. She knows the technology world. She knows what's good about it, as I did when I started Salon, the digital publication. And she knows what's very bad about the technology world. She comes from Silicon Valley. She also grew up poor. Her father had mental issues, couldn't hold a job. Her mother was a Chinese immigrant. She grew up bussing tables. I want someone who actually knows the value of a dollar in the White House, not just an elitist who was born to great wealth and entitlement. So she knows, too, what it's like to be poor, as well as to be wealthy, obviously. So, yes, I think the media spin on her once again has her wrong. I think it was a wise choice. Now let's talk about Tulsi, because she was someone, a former Democrat like Bobby, more independent-minded, Iraq War veteran, someone who knows the war complex, the military industrial complex quite well from the inside. I was kind of rooting for her, and I like the way she speaks on stage during the Democratic primary last time around. I thought she was quite good, quite effective. And of course, Fox News has embraced her, and she
Yeah,
has been
she
away.
does have some. She has a military intelligence connection, and is also very
Yes,
pro.
there's something
She
very
like is
creepy about it.
basically quite pro Israel and anti
I
Muslim. She
know.
basically totally accepts the
Praise,
global war on terror narrative, except she says we should be more careful
exactly.
about it.
So what I'm told, and I don't know if this is true, is that the Trump campaign heard about the Kennedy's campaign talking to her, and seriously talking to her about joining them as Bobby's running mate, and they swooped in and made her a better offer. And I've heard that she will be announced as Trump's running mate, Tulsi Gabbard. If she went, if it's true, she went from being a Democrat to Trumpy. To me, in my mind, that's like David Horowitz, the former editor of Ramparts, who went from the left to the far, far right. It's a shift that I can't abide, that I think is mercenary and disgusting. And frankly,
I think Horowitz was always a plant.
you might have been. But in any case, Tulsi might be a plan. Who knows at this point? If
Yeah.
she is able to do that political shift, then in my mind, she's beyond the pale. So I think the Nicole Shanahan, I think Bobby might have dodged a bullet here. I think the Nicole Shanahan pick, someone who is young, who is the daughter of an immigrant, who grew up poor, someone who is as equally adamant about the environment, cleaning up the environment as he is, and against forever wars. The two things that in the corporate capture of Washington, I think, which are his two major themes of his campaign: the corporate capture and the forever wars that we've endured as a country, and the massive shift of wealth that's gone along with that, from the middle class to the billionaires at the top. I think that's very, very on point. So I do agree that it's a great combination, Kennedy Shanahan, and I'm going to work my ass off to elect them.
Well, I think that it's not out of the realm of possibility that they'll win. I don't know how to handicap these things, and I'm a bit more sanguine about it now because I'm not working on any one side of it, which is probably a better position for me to be in. And it's but I think he may have a chance. The media coverage has been less uniformly hostile to him in certain respects. I'm It's a strange campaign he's been running. As much as he's saying, my campaign is going to be telling the people the truth, with his Israel positions and some other probable punches that he pulls, or just his positions generally on being pro-business and such, I feel that a part of his campaign has really been to the deep state, in a sense. It's to the oligarchy, in a sense, to say that I do respect certain boundaries. I'm not going to question the sacrosanctity of the wonderful free enterprise system, and I'm not going to go after Israel. And those two do seem to be the kind of the pillars in some way of like a lot of the consensus that we have, the neoconservative and neoliberal capitalist consensus. I mean, I think that neoconservatism has been largely propelled by Zionism. I mean, I think when you look back at people like Wolfowitz and Pearl and all these people with connections to Israel and so on,
Elliot
yeah, plenty of these guys. And then the neoliberal side is, David Rockefeller capitalism. It's unassailable in the United States, unfortunately. And so he's, in a sense, been campaigning or making a case to the deep state, I think, which is, on the one hand, it's, his parents were killed his father was killed and his uncle was killed by the deep state. And yet here he is making kind of an appeal to these same forces, these same oligarchic forces, I think, with a bit of his restraint in some areas. And I think that he is the choice that they should actually want to make. and it does give us the best chance of not getting the world blown up, even though I don't I don't like this oligarchy, and I don't really want them to be able to continue to have a position of the power that they do. I think his campaign has been a strange, part Democratic, part appeal to the higher authority. It's really something.
But Aaron, I think that's the way you win politically, particularly at the national level in this crazy country, violent country of ours. I think let's get real for a minute about Bobby's campaign. I think number one, he's has been very critical of the neocon wing of the foreign policy establishment. He cheered, as Kennedy cheered, the recent expulsion of Victoria Nuland, who's one of the chief architects of the neocon strategy against Russia, from the State Department recently. So Bobby has been very, very critical of that neocon way of thinking. You're right, though. On Israel, he's compromised heavily. I think, like JFK, and I've said this before on your show, like his uncle JFK, Bobby Kennedy realizes that a presidential campaign is a polyglot endeavor, and you can't win without bringing in certain elements across the spectrum. You can't take power in the White House. So on Israel, I think he's heavily compromised. He's made deals with those who could actually back him, finance him, give him support, frankly, keep him alive. Because Biden doesn't give a damn. Biden has a bust of his father, Bobby Kennedy's father, in the White House, but he doesn't give a damn about his security. He's denied.
Which makes it a little weird. It makes it a little weird. It makes it almost seem like a mounted deep state trophy on his wall or something. It's kind of sick.
I know, it's sick. He's an sick fuck, I think, in some ways, Biden. But that's
I don't see how you get into any other conclusion. It's been sickening watching him deal with this issue, and in his dotage, and that's what I feel like they want to blame this on Biden and Netanyahu. They kind of want to just say, when everything that Israel has been doing has been to avoid the creation of a Palestinian state, which really only leads to some kind of terrible final solution. So it's like this didn't come out of nowhere, and it definitely is not, oh, it's just Bibi, and oh, if only it was not Bibi, the other great Israeli people would do something different, or it's Biden and he's senile, and oh no, he's just, we've got a senile guy in charge, and that's the problem. It's not. It's these two twin fascist projects of U.S. global empire forever, and then Zionism. I mean, and they have had their own momentum and inertia, and it's brought us to this terrible point. And they're basically, I think, dashing themselves against the rocks in Ukraine and in Palestine. And this is world historic.
But so what I wanted to say in endorsing Bobby and supporting and writing for Bobby's campaign is that even JFK was a cold warrior when he ran against Nixon, as you know, in 1960. Bobby Kennedy says things, brings people into this coalition who he doesn't always agree with. And he doesn't because he realizes, number one, they keep him alive. Do you know how important, how big a presidential campaign is? I mean, even at his private party that I went to on Tuesday, there was heavy security at that party. And he knew all those people coming into the room, and they're friends of his. But yet he's required to pay for heavy security, even at a private party. There were 50 people there. It was amazing and sad, actually, how much security he needs to stay alive. I think there are people not in power, like his uncle, and his father, who want him dead. And they rather, the DNC and Biden, by not providing him Secret Service protection, would rather that he not be there, would rather that he be dead. That's what they're saying. And despite his high standing in the polls and so on, or because of it, they don't want him as a political threat. So it's outrageous that he has to do this. But my point is, a presidential campaign is not as pure as you and I would like, as consistent progressives. We're allowed to be, as journalists, as consistent as we can be on issues. He's not. No presidential candidate can be. You have to have as big a coalition, a winning coalition, as possible. Now, once he gets into the White House, if he does get into the White House and he governs the way that you and I can applaud courageously and like the visionary I think he is, and like I say, the most intelligent person that it would ever be president since his uncle JFK, because I've known Bobby for over 20 years, then that's, if he governs that way, then we'll applaud him. If he doesn't, if he decides that he has to compromise and so forth, which I don't think he will, then that's a different story. So I wish he the best. I know how difficult it is to run for president in this country. I can imagine getting up every day, flying somewhere like Bobby does, speaking to people, having the security does, trying to, the hostile media that want him out of the race, the hostile Democratic DNC that is denying him access to the ballots. That's the definition of anti-democracy, to deny your competition access to ballots. That's like Putin's Russia. It's not the America that we were raised to believe in. It's disgusting. So my own Democratic Party, and I was a Democrat all my life until recently, is now turned into this corrupt authoritarian organization. So yes, I wish him the best, and I hope he and Shanahan win this November.
Well, I am here as an observer in this respect, and I hope that whoever wins is sensible enough to accept the reality that the global dominance project never should have really been pursued the way that it was. There were people who argued against it. Henry Wallace, perhaps most famously. And then JFK tries to reverse it, RFK too. And they had to stage a coup against Wallace. They had to kill JFK. They had to kill RFK. Many crimes have been committed to keep this thing going, but now I don't think they can keep it going. And that is fundamentally different. And that is what the next president is going to have to deal with. I think that on the whole, RFK's approach is better than these other people, and that he could do the things in terms of overhauling regulation and declassifying some really explosive national, state secrets regarding crimes of the state. I think that these could be fundamentally transformative for the U.S. and in ways that would actually, be in line with what generally people on the left would want from the U.S. But the Israel business is so odious that I think it's tricky. We'll see how that is handled. The thing about him also, though, that I think a lot of people don't think about is his uncle was killed by the state, and then Israel may have played a part in the Ruby aspect of that. I think that's quite plausible. And at any rate, the next patsy assassin was a Palestinian, which is no accident, and I think reflects the power of Zionism in the U.S. political system, especially the deep political system.
Sirhan, who supposedly killed Bobby's father, and Bobby went behind bars with Sirhan and said, "No, you didn't fire the shot that killed my father." He knows the truth.
Yeah. And then additionally, I mean, it seems quite suspicious and disturbing that the only U.S. Article in the U.S. press about the Rabin assassination, Rabin was like JFK, was going for peace, and he was assassinated by forces aligned with this emerging character at that time, Bibi Netanyahu. And then JFK Jr., the publisher of George magazine, published that story. He dies in a plane crash that seems to look like one of those assassinations through accident, vehicular accident kind of a thing. Like the CIA writes about these in its assassination manual, and Israel would be a suspect in that. So, and his security seems to be perhaps connected to Israeli intelligence today, RFK Jr.'s security. So, and Israel is armed with nukes and has an insane mindset, as we see with the Gaza genocide, to where this is not a small thing to think about how to try to diffuse. And I don't think that simply standing there and pointing to the brazen criminality and immorality of the whole enterprise is going to work, because it hasn't worked to this point. Although I think for the rest of the world, they are turning against Israel for those reasons. But this is a fraught political moment, and if somebody with enough knowledge of how these circles operate could at least diffuse the risk of nuclear war, then that would be a great historical accomplishment. And if RFK Jr. were to do that, he would redeem himself after these criminally terrible statements in support of a political formation that is carrying out genocide in front of the whole world. I mean, this is, I think that he would go into office recognizing that he has some work to do to reform himself in the eyes of history.
Yes, I agree, Aaron, and I think that's a good way to close today.
David Talbot, always great to talk to you. And we've both been interviewed for a JFK documentary that is going to be at least interesting. At the very least, I hope it turns out really well. And so, again, great to speak to you, and thanks for joining us again today.
My pleasure, Aaron. Thank you.
James DiEugenio, thanks for joining us on Devil's Chess Club.
Thank you so much for having me, Aaron.
James, you recently wrote a review of For Died Trying, who is sponsoring Devil's Chess Club. And since you were a person who's, I think, ideally situated to write about this, the prologue episode, you wrote a review of the prologue. I think you're ideally situated to write about this because you were the main editor of a volume the first volume that really dealt with all four assassinations back in the, you were writing about these in the 90s, and I think the book came out around 99 or 2000.
No, this was in 2003.
Okay, the assassinations with you and Lisa Pease, and most of the writing was done in the late 90s, or as I recall. Okay.
Yes.
So you're the perfect person to write this review. Tell us what you thought of the film.
Well, okay, I've only seen the prologue. Okay. But the book you're referring to as The Assassinations, which was an anthology from Probe Magazine. And Probe Magazine covered all four of the assassinations of the 1960s, which in order were JFK, Malcolm, King, and Bobby Kennedy. And we deliberately tried to do that, all right, because too often people just look at them as one case, okay, as one step, as one murder, okay, and we thought what was missing was the gestalt, okay. So in the afterword to that book, The Assassinations, I wrote, is it really possible to pick and choose four progressive leaders and do away with them under suspicious circumstances in the space of 5 years? Can that really be a coincidence? You know? And I came to the conclusion I didn't think so. And I said, look at the political effect. The political effect of those four murders was devastating. Okay. It brought us Richard Nixon. All right. And it brought us Ronald Reagan. It brought us the whole neocon Republican revolution, you know. So I thought somebody should bring this point up, okay, because the MSM isn't. And so now we have this film by John Kirby and Libby Hondros, the director and the producer, For Died Trying, which finally, finally, somebody takes up this idea in film form, and I think it's very interesting the way they started out, in the prologue, as a kind of overture to all the themes that are going to be struck during the actual series. I think one of the most interesting things that they did was the whole looking back at America before the JFK assassination. You know, that was one of the sub themes that they put in there. You know, and I hate to say this, but I was actually around at that time. Okay, so I understand uh, what they're talking about. You know, and it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe unless you were there. Um, what a shock to the system the JFK assassination was. Um, and that's one of the things that they're going to try and describe the impact of. Okay, just how big the impact of the JFK assassination really was, and uh, that is a very admirable goal to have. Okay, because the difference and the overall thing. See, the 1960s, if you examine that decade, you had the Camelot 60s, okay, up until the assassination of JFK. Then you had what I call the angry 60s, which was over the Vietnam War and civil rights, the battle for civil rights, the angry 60s. Then, after the assassination of King and Bobby Kennedy, you had the stoned out 60s, the dropout 60s, the hippies, the yippies, Woodstock, okay, everything that Woodstock represented, okay.
Well,
Let's
really, Altamont was when it became.
Okay, you
It
could
really
say
took
that
that
also.
hopelessly dark turn, but I agree
Uh,
that it's
uh,
Woodstock in the shadow of those assassinations is a weird thing to contemplate.
yes, and why don't you explain what you're talking about? Because Woodstock is much more popular than Ultima.
Right, well, Woodstock is the like
No, no,
more
explain what
archetypal music
Ultima was.
festival where it's like, oh, it's the good times, it's like the high point of the psychedelic era according to some people, but then Altamont is a sort of follow up, and it's the Rolling Stones playing this concert, and Peter Del Scott was there for some of it with his little 3-year-old daughter on his shoulders. He told me, but they left before the Hell's Angels started killing people, so that was probably good. Not a family
Mhm.
friendly venue, but the Altamont, which I think happens in 1970, is considered like the moment, like the end of the 60s by some people, because it was such a bizarre thing, and there was a really brutal murder there by the Hells Angels.
Mhm.
It was just a really dark end, and it kind of seems to point to a new dark turn in American culture. But really, the assassinations were already pretty dark, and somehow they went ahead with Woodstock anyway afterwards. So it's a weird era. And then add on top of that the fact that the CIA seems to have been manipulating the counterculture, perhaps to discredit the new left. I mean,
Mhm.
that's Tim Leary said things to that effect if you listen to him at certain times. So the whole era is very weird, and it does get into, eventually you get this hangover from the 60s, and after these assassinations it's like, what the hell happened?
Right. And so if you look at it historically, okay, it's very marked. It's very marked as what happened. Okay, as from those three phases. All right, and essentially, what you had essentially after '68, you had essentially a culture that was many of the young people had dropped out. Many of the young people had become discouraged for good reason. Okay. So in the afterword to that book, I tried to pose this question, you know, um, if for some reason in, say, like the 1980s, somehow Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and Newt Gingrich, okay, and say Tom DeLay were all killed in the space of 5 years, would everybody just think that that was a coincidence? Okay, that there was no reason or rhyme behind it, but yet that's what we're supposed to expect happen from '63 to '68. Which, looking back, I said, you know, that is really an incredible coincidence to try and swallow. that somehow this was all by chance, that this was all happenstance, you know. Uh, and so that's the question that that book tried to pose, and I think that's what this series, okay, For Die Trying, okay, is trying to translate into film terms. Was this all just a coincidence? And if it was just a coincidence, why did America change so much? Why did America change in the space of just a few years from this Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet kind of culture to a that's something that ends up, you know, with drugs, and killings and violence and the apotheosis of the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive. Okay, uh, with literally, millions of dead Vietnamese and Cambodians, in a war that should. How did that happen? And why did it happen? And so
Did
you
you
can sit.
see, Jim? Did you happen to see? I know we actually talked about this, and the article. You and I talked about this previously, and then in the last week's episode of Devil's Chess Club, we talk about the story. But Judge Napolitano talking to Jeffrey Sachs, and of course he talks about the Trump JFK thing, which we don't need to review here. But what was really interesting to me is Jeffrey Sachs now basically echoes my analysis on JFK, and which I'm sure you would agree with. Because when I went to Temple University to apply for my doctorate, I had to give a writing sample, and I wrote an essay that was like the Kennedy assassinations were they really marked the end of American liberalism, and I explained why. And part of what happens is because it leads right to Vietnam, and Vietnam leads right to the end of the dollar, and then that leads to the oil shocks and the debt crises and the Volcker shock and all that. All of these things to establish this new dollar regime under Reagan. You think of the fortunes that were made because of that transition and that new type of system that was really put in, because it really was, it affected a coup of the global financial system, the global monetary system, the global political economy with what happened. And it made people rich beyond imagining because of that. And so it changed things, not culturally, but in every aspect. And Jeffrey Sachs, getting back to what I wanted to interject with, was Jeffrey Sachs in that interview says, yes, this was probably the most decisive moment in modern American history.
Okay, are you talking about Nixon's conversion?
No, Jeffrey Sachs, well, that's part of it. Nixon getting rid of the gold window and taking us off Bretton Woods. But it's not just that. It's that the oil shocks and the Volcker shock and the third world debt crisis, all these things together contribute to what we see under Reagan, the Reagan Revolution, and the massive the economic recovery, quote unquote, but also this shift towards unproductive investments, and financial speculation really taking over the economy in key ways.
Yes,
Like
yes.
they brought that in, and killing it stems consequentially from the Kennedy assassination, because Kennedy was himself obsessed with maintaining the Bretton Woods system, controlling the gold outflow and everything else. So among
Yes.
other motives they had for killing him, they launched the Vietnam War, and then they create this new dollar regime. So it ended up being like it affected like a heist, not even a heist, I mean, there is a heist element involved, especially with the Indonesian gold, but that's a separate issue. It just resulted in a shift of wealth that is unimaginable as this new system was put in. And
Yeah.
Jeffrey Sachs was saying this was the most consequential moment. And I think it's warped our politics. I think you almost can't overstate the importance of the Kennedy assassination at this point.
Kennedy's his whole idea for the economy, okay, was to have a productive industrial base, okay, that that he tried to encourage. He tried to encourage investment in industry, okay, and that's what him uh, and his Council of Economic Advisors, okay, they try to encourage this kind of a policy rather than the one that believed in more or less a speculative, okay, financial services kind of economy. All right, and he really believed that encouraging investment in things like uh, factories, in things like equipment, okay, that he could go ahead and grow the American industrial base, okay, and he thought that if he could do that, then that would, like his famous motto was, you know, raising all boats. Okay. That if you kept American industrial growth growing, okay, that everybody in the economy would benefit from this. All right. Now, what you're talking about, what happens later, is the whole transformation of the American economy into an investor kind of an economy rather than a productive uh, kind of economy. All right. And
Like
it's sort
a predatory rent seeking
right.
paradigm comes to predominate, and
Yeah.
that
And it
heavily
happens
favors
pretty fast.
speculation and takeovers and looting of companies, looting of
Yeah.
countries, everything else.
It happened pretty fast, by the way. Okay. You know, and it's something that Kennedy really tried to resist. All right. Uh, and see, that one of the things that I wrote about in I think it was my book Destiny Betrayed. That if you really fundamentally look at the JFK administration, see, Kennedy was really a nationalist at heart. Okay, uh, and he
But
and this I
in the he was a nationalist and an internationalist. He believed in peaceful cooperative nationalism, not a nationalist of the, Adolf Hitler
no
variety.
no 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 of course not.
I only
Okay,
say I only say that because nationalism, it has this is especially people on the left have a take
well
on
today
nationalism
it's
that's a
been
little weird.
completely yeah, but by
It's like Kwame
nationalism,
Nkrumah was a nationalist. Anybody's a nationalist if you advocate if you try to organize your own country in a sensible way, then that presupposes that you are a nationalist, and so
right.
on.
See, but and on the other hand, he also tried to encourage that in foreign countries. He wanted foreign countries to be able to go ahead and rule their own destiny, like Indonesia being a good example. Okay, and of course, what in that regard, it's so interesting. Roger Hilsman was the undersecretary for, I think, East Asia. All right. And he wrote a book called To Move a Nation, which I believe is 65 or something like that. And he said one of the problems with Kennedy's foreign policy is that in many cases, he was the only one for it. He was the only one advocating for certain areas. And he used Indonesia as a perfect example. Okay. That when Kennedy was in Dallas, there was a bill on his desk that everybody knew he was going to sign to begin a huge loan package to Sukarno. And then when Kennedy was assassinated and Johnson didn't sign that bill, he said everybody knew that there was a big transformation that was coming up because Kennedy would have signed it by rote and then the rest of the grant would have fallen into place. Well, when Johnson didn't sign it, okay, none of it went into place, and everybody in his department realized we're changing policies, because Kennedy was the only one advocating for Sukarno. Okay, and so I'm sure you've talked about this with Peter Scott about what
Oh yeah,
happened
there were
in
and others. We've had other shows on it too. I mean,
what
the
happened in Indonesia,
changeover there. Yeah,
right?
and this is, they'll spend time on this in other subsequent Ford trying
Oh,
films,
that's
but
that's terrific because we got it into the long version of Oliver's film, JFK Destiny Betrayed. We got about 10 minutes of that into that film. So I'm glad they're going to cover it in this because it's a very overlooked part of history. Okay, that deserves to be fully explored because it was so devastating, to that country. And it's an example of what Kennedy was trying to do. He was trying to encourage nationalism in these former colonies, these former European colonies, for them to find their own way, to be able to boost their own economies. All right. And that to put it mildly, that didn't work out very well.
Right.
Okay.
And it's just the same thing. I mean, it's the same. It's so relevant to today because it's not just some sort of hippie, bleeding heart thing. It's that he recognized, he said things that were quite on to the point. He talked about imperialism as the great enemy of mankind, and it's ultimately going to lose because of mankind's desire to be free and independent. He said there's a revolution. He and RFK with like, there's a revolution coming, and we need to be on the right side of it. It's the same
Right.
thing that we see today with the BRICS and these other countries trying to set something up, trying to set up a new international system to escape this predatory imperialist system that Kennedy realized was untenable. And so he tried to fight it, but the time, I think, was not right. And the balance of the U.S. oligarchy was like, no, you're not going to, you cannot overturn this consensus, and it's not up for democratic debate.
Well, see, he always talked about being on the wrong side of history. Okay. And in fact, his famous, and I imagine this is going to be in the film, it should be in the film, the great Algeria speech, the 1957 speech that Kennedy gave in the summer of 1957 about the French refusing to let this colony on the north coast of Africa, Algeria, be free. All right. And Kennedy made what, if you look at it today, it's really kind of shocking, to read that speech, that somebody said that on the floor of the U.S. Senate back in 1957. You know, at the end of the speech, he says words to the effect, "Did everybody here forget what happened 3 years ago? How could anybody forget Dien Bien Phu? Okay, we were on the wrong side of history then, and we're going to be on the wrong side of history here. What we should be doing is, if we're a true friend of Paris, we should be helping France to the negotiating table. The other objective we should have is to free Africa." All right. Now, that speech, if you recall, I'm sure you do, Kennedy was shocked by the violent attack on him on that speech because his office kept a clipping service. It was 3-1 against. Okay. Even Stevenson attacked him. Even Dean Acheson, people in his own party were attacking him.
Well,
Okay.
Dean Acheson's sort of he's above the parties.
Yeah, he's a chameleon.
But
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. And so he calls up his father and he says, "Did I make a mistake?" And his father goes, "You don't know how lucky you are. This is only going to get worse. A year from now, everybody's going to look at you as being a prophet." And if you can believe it, that's what happened. 8 months later, he's on the cover of Time magazine, and the story inside is "Man Out Front," you know. And so this is the kind of thing he was talking about. If we are not on the right side of history, the forces against us will arrange it so that we are on the wrong side of history. And that's what's happened with BRICS, with the Road and Beltway project, with China, with Russia and China being more together now because of the Ukraine crisis. All right. So this is what he feared would happen. And this is what's happening.
It's the dialectic of history, or if you want to summarize it in a lowbrow way, as I think it's Princess Leia who says to Darth Vader, "The more you tighten your grip, the more star systems will slip through your grasp." Right? I mean, this is the way that empires rise and fall. It's just a truism, translated to dopey sci-fi, but it's a truism that empires fall for these very reasons, that they ultimately, because of the greed that propelled them in the first place, they pursue greed and power too mindlessly, and they go beyond what they can actually sustain, and then all of a sudden it becomes an untenable project and it ends. It may seem that like the U.S. empire, is a permanent thing, but in reality, like into World War II, not that many, less than a century ago, it's going to come and go. It's not going to last as long as these Chinese dynasties or as the Roman Empire or the
Hmm.
British Empire. It's just because it's just the way the history was. And people like Henry Wallace, people like JFK understood this. But it's like the oligarchy that really was decisive was like, no, you can't, that we have this opportunity to be number one for a while and we're going to do it. We'd be crazy not to. I think that must have been their thinking.
Hmm. See the what you talked about earlier, uh, with the great conversion of the American economy. How the United States was an incredibly rich country with so many financial assets at the end of World War II. You know, we were an incredible creditor organization. Well, that all changed, and it didn't take very long for it to change. For the United States to become one of the huge debtor nations, in the world. All right, and
In a
that
sense, but they are in debt in a currency that only they can produce. So it's a different kind of way that they are in debt, and it's kind of a predatory way of being in debt that the U.S. engineered. It's pretty astounding, actually, because
well,
they can dominate the world from a position of being a debtor, and the rest of the world holds U.S. Treasury debt like it's taken the place of gold, or at least it has until recently. It's an astounding thing that they were able to pull off.
right. But in my opinion, that's changing also.
Yes.
That's
It's not
that's
just your
that
opinion.
that I don't think that's going to last very much longer. Okay, and with BRICS, I think that they will eventually go to a different kind of a currency. Once they're fully organized. There's so many countries joining BRICS now. In order to get away from the United States. You know, so we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah.
But this
I mean, it's because the
series,
U.S. is essentially just saying, "Please let us keep screwing you forever." Why would you not want that? But anyway, I'm sorry. Go back to the
eh,
series.
yeah, yeah. What this series does, though, I think, and I hope it continues in this vein. It sets up this whole dichotomy of before and after, how much America changed, as a result of those four cases, you know, and the fact that they were all resolved so unsatisfactorily in almost every sense of that word. I think that led to the chaos, of 1968. And if you don't remember 1968, then you should really read up on it. Okay, because 1968 was, a lot of people call it the maelstrom. All right, it's so many things happened in that one year that it's kind of mind-boggling. All right, you had the Tet Offensive, you had the abdication of Lyndon Johnson, you had the murder of Martin Luther King. Okay. You had the murder of Bobby Kennedy just 2 months later. All right. And then you had the election of Richard Nixon, who everybody thought was a dead ghost. Nobody ever thought that that guy was going to come back, but those events helped him to come back. And that really, really altered the topography, of American politics, because most historians consider Nixon to be one of the worst presidents, if not the worst president, in modern American history. There's three things a president is supposed to do. He's supposed to keep the peace, do everything he can to keep the peace. He's supposed to expand the economy, and he's supposed to bring the American public together. Those are three strikes against Richard Nixon. Okay, he didn't do any of those things, and I think the American populace was forever changed by that. And I don't think it would have happened without those four events in front of it. So 68 was an absolutely, there's been whole books written about it. There's been several books written about it, about what happened that year. Okay. And I'm sure
Yeah.
the film will take a lot of time on that.
Right. And it's not just it's not because here we have this world with problems, and then all of a sudden one guy alone, John Kennedy, understands these problems and has some solutions for him, but then the big mean people in charge kill him. It's really that there were a lot of social forces and other important actors who were working in along similar lines. MLK, of course, with civil rights is sort of narrow at this time, but it's important. But also Dag Hammarskjöld is an internationalist. There's a lot of, I mean, even Malcolm X was becoming optimistic about some things in America around this time period, because, well, for different reasons. There were kind of progressive internationalist forces. You had a more progressive pope. You had figures like Thomas Merton, and it seemed to be building towards something better than more empire, more Western imperialism, which is really what the U.S. had on tap. And then those pressures, because they deal with this by getting rid of Kennedy. But then the result of this new right wing lurch with LBJ, especially in foreign policy, is that people there's a lot of unhappiness about Vietnam and everything else. And by '68, those forces are back stronger than ever, with MLK calling for the same thing as RFK in his campaign, fighting racism, militarism, and economic exploitation. And they had two extremely powerful leaders, an establishment person and an activist person. And then the way that the establishment deals with them is to just murder them. And then also perversely, the murders function sort of like a Gladio operation or a strategy of tension operation in Europe, where they would stage some terror attacks, and it would make the population sort of lurch to the right and want the state to protect them. Nixon runs on a law and order platform. And so the assassinations kind of helped to get him elected, not just because they get rid of the competition, but because people actually want the state. They want somebody who's sort of a, law and order type person. And Nixon, exploits that.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt about that. That was his big law. The law and order motto was one of his big, as well as the secret plan to end the Vietnam War. Okay. Those are the two things that he tried to take advantage of. All right. The law and order thing, it was really, really bizarre, because the reason that there were these disturbances was A, protests against the Vietnam War. All right. And B, the civil rights issue. Okay. So that's why you had these outbreaks, of violence. If you remember the Newark riot, okay, I think 30 some people died in that riot. Okay. That was topped by the Detroit riot, which I think there's something like 42 people died in, which I think the Detroit riot is still one of the biggest urban disturbances in the history of the United States. Okay. It chewed up something like 18 square miles, you know. So, you know, these are the things that Nixon was trying to take advantage of. All right. To say that we need law and order, when in fact, in my opinion, the reason that many of these things broke out was because of Johnson and his conduct of the Vietnam War, and the fact that he didn't follow up very well on what Kennedy was planning after his Civil Rights Act was going to be passed. That's a whole different subject, which I don't think the film will go into. Okay, but those are the advantages that Nixon saw in this turmoil that was breaking out, and which he fully decided to utilize, for pragmatic political purposes.
Right, right. Now, Jim, the last thing I want to talk about here today is your book, Chokeholds, uh, a new book, and you can explain the book. And then I want to talk about one chapter in it on the head wound, because it's, or on the direction of the head of the shots that killed JFK. So why don't you tell us about the book, Chokeholds, and then we'll talk about that chapter.
All right. The book is entitled The JFK Assassination Chokeholds, which I have right here. All right. And it's inescapable conclusions that lead to a conspiracy. And I'm one of the authors, along with Paul Blow, along with Andrew Eiler, Matt Crumpton, and Mark Adamczyk. And we decided to pick what we thought were certain topics which there could be no benign explanation to. And so, um, therefore, uh, we argue, for example, that there's no benign explanation to 60 years of obstruction of justice, which is the concluding chapter. How can you say that after 6 decades and we still don't have all the files released? How can you say that there's a benign explanation for that? We talk about Jack Ruby's actions. How can there be a benign explanation for that? you know Matt Crumpton, 17 Oswald impersonations. That's just a coincidence. Now the part you're talking about is the evidence of a frontal shot. Okay. um and
The
what that
title,
is.
the title, I think, is very concise. Proof of a front shot is overwhelming, which I would agree with.
Okay, what that means is that if a bullet comes in at a certain direction, it will leave most of the large fragments, if there's a breakup, near uh, near the furthest point, while the smaller fragments will be near the point of entry. Okay, because the larger fragments have more mass, they will travel further, whereas the smaller fragments with no mass stay right where they're at. Okay, and so if you look at this pattern, and by the way, the guy who explained that phenomenon was Larry Sturtevant, who's a Warren Commission guy. All right. And so if you take a look at the x rays, especially the enhanced x rays of Kennedy's skull, that's the pattern. The smaller dust like fragments are at the front of the head, while the larger, heavier fragments are near the back of the skull. So that's a perfect kind of, evidentiary trajectory that proves, a shot came from the front of the skull. In
So
other
is
words,
that the
in front of
only
Kennedy.
is that the only thing that suggests that?
No, because there's also something called the Zapruder film, okay, which shows Kennedy, rocketing backwards, and there's also the famous 42 witnesses who saw a blasted out evulsive hole in the back of Kennedy's head, all right, which is strongly indicative. Everybody knows that, well, almost everybody knows that exit holes leave much larger points of exit than much larger holes than do entrance wounds. The hole in the back of Kennedy's skull, which the House Select Committee tried to cover up, okay, has 42 witnesses saying that there was something like a kind of baseball sized hole in the back of Kennedy's head, which is very strong evidence of again, of a shot from the front. Okay, so these kinds of things,
So
you
there's the
know,
eyewitness, and these were witnesses at Dallas, but also at the Naval Hospital. And the Naval Hospital witnesses were more or less, that evidence was hidden away for a long time, that was what they
that's
had said.
that's
So,
exactly
so we
true.
have video evidence suggesting pretty unmistakably, if anybody's seen the Zapruder film, that he was shot from the front. We have the X-ray, the particles from the medical evidence and X-rays suggesting that, and we have there's video evidence, eyewitness testimony, and the X-rays. And so that's
Right,
3 points.
right. Okay, and these are, like you just said, there was an agreement between the people who saw Kennedy's corpse at Parkland, and an agreement with the witnesses who saw Kennedy's corpse at Bethesda. And this is something the House Select Committee tried to confuse by saying that there was no such agreement. But when the ARB declassified all these documents, it turned out that there was an agreement. I think it's very difficult to argue that many witnesses were all wrong. I
So
just,
the HSCA had to have consciously buried the Bethesda
yes, that's
testimony.
true. There's no other explanation for that. And the capper on this is that when Gary Aguilar confronted them with this new evidence, nobody wanted to admit that they wrote that part of the report. It's in volume 7, page 37 of the House Select Committee, where they say that opposed to the people at Parkland, the witnesses in Bethesda did not see this. Well, that's an utter lie, okay, because the witnesses, they did see it, and it's very hard to believe the House Select Committee did not know this. All right. This is why nobody wanted to take credit for that part of the report. Michael Bodden was there, Andy Purdy was there, Robert Blakey was there, and they all said, "No, no, 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 it wasn't me. It wasn't me." Well, who was it then? You know.
Yeah, that would be a good one to really try to nail Blakey down on.
Mm.
I do have a feeling there must be some aspects of what went on in that time period that he has never shared, explaining
Yeah,
what sort of
yeah,
dictates he was given, because this would be something worth knowing. He covered up some things that were very significant. Well, that and the way that they handled, well, this is related. Berkeley, right? The president's physician, like he wanted to approach the HSCA at some point, and it probably was related to the head wound. You think, or
well, we don't know what he wanted to talk about.
yeah,
Okay, but he did initially want to talk to Sprague. Sprague was the first uh, chief counsel, and he wrote a letter to Sprague asking to talk to him about some certain evidence that he was nebulous about, in the Kennedy case. And so what happens? And by the way, Berkeley did this something like 3 times. Okay, he approached someone, saying that he wanted to talk about the Kennedy assassination, and then backed out of it. On 3 different occasions. So I believe, yeah, that Berkeley took some secrets to his grave. It's too bad that he passed away before the ARB, because I'm sure the ARB would have given him a good interview. In
right?
case you don't know what we're
Or they would
talking
have
about.
killed him. They would have killed him like they did Richard Case Nagel. I mean, somebody would have
uh,
killed him.
Berkeley was Kennedy's private physician. Okay.
And he was under surveillance after that, right? Or Secret Service
Yes,
protection in some way. Like,
They visited him annually. The Secret Service went out there to Seattle where he was living. Okay. And they paid it. Now, there is no stricture in the Secret Service that they're supposed to visit the past president's principal physician every year. So what they were doing out there is in visiting Berkeley is very, very interesting to speculate about.
I mean, when I think about that Secret Service angle, I've never thought, oh, it was the Secret Service that did it. But I do believe that the head of the Secret Service, Dillon, was likely in the loop about it and was part of because he wasn't just a government official. He was a oligarch essentially. Like his family, the Dillon family were the people that had the Dillon Reed banking house, which is one of the oldest, most illustrious investment banks, and it was Dillon Reed people who wanted the CIA created in the first place, like James Forrestal and Ferdinand Eberstadt. So the fact that, and he was a guy, Doug Dillon, who wanted, he was under Eisenhower, advising Eisenhower to assassinate Patrice Lumumba. So he's a guy, that's who was in charge of Kennedy's security. And if you think about it, why is the head of the Treasury in charge of the protection of the president in any way when it's always a bunch of bankers who run that? I mean, it's actually kind of a scary, disturbing
Yeah,
arrangement when you think about it.
yeah, you're exactly right. Dillon was over Rowley. Rowley was the titular head of the Secret Service, but Dillon had ultimate suzerainty over the Secret Service segment. That's exactly correct. So I really hope, I haven't seen the rest of the film yet. I'm going to see part 1 very soon.
Before Die
Okay.
Trying.
Yes, for died trying, but I really hope it fills out a lot of these questions. They sure as heck interviewed a heck of a lot of people. Okay, I mean, really, literally scores of people that they interviewed for this. Must have taken them years to do it. All right, and so from that point of view, they interviewed a lot of very good people. Okay, I give them a lot of credit for tracking these people down and getting these in-person interviews. All right. So this should be very interesting to see how this saga, and it really is a saga, how it, and of course, from what everything I said, it has an epic quality to it. Okay, an epic is supposed to tell of a turning point historically in a nation's progress. So this has an epic quality to it, okay, which I hope it really does fulfill.
I believe that it will, and I think that the thesis of the film that the four died trying in order to really democratize this country, complete the democratization of this country, which was very incomplete up to that point. That is solid, and they interviewed family members and other associates of the four leaders. I mean, I think that it's a huge contribution alone what they've done there. And what I'm hoping is that people will see the series and then they will want to look more into these cases, and then works like yours will be very valuable, like your book Choke Points, which is out now. So I'm hoping I'm sorry, Chokeholds. Yeah, thank you. Chokeholds, and it will be hopefully it will encourage people to be more invested in these cases and learning about the history that they've tried to hide from us. So I'm really happy you wrote that book, and I'm happy to be a part of promoting this film. And let's hope that here, with the regime that killed them now looking pretty weak globally, maybe this will be a way. Maybe we're in for some revelations as a way to reform this whole system, because even if you're an oligarch at this point, you got to realize that there needs to be some changes, and maybe looking back at our real history would be a way to do it, so we could go forward honestly. So I salute you for your efforts in this regard.
Thank you so much for that, Aaron.
Jim, thank you so much for joining me today.
Okay, have a good day, partner.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. You can buy or rent The Four Died Trying Prologue now on Amazon and other streaming platforms. Chapter 1 is also available now. Visit fourdiedtrying.com for details. Please do subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for first access to all Devil's Chess Club episodes, and for all new and past episodes of the American Exception podcast, including the Peter Dale Scott Oral History series. Thanks to Jim DiEugenio for joining us again. Check the show notes for a link to his excellent new book, Chokeholds. Full title: The JFK Assassination Chokeholds That Inescapably Prove There Was a Conspiracy. It is a very useful resource laying out an unassailable case against the U.S. regime, establishing its guilt regarding the JFK assassination. JFK, Malcolm X, MLK, RFK, they knocked off so many people. And yet here we are, in 2024, watching the devil lose on his own chessboard.